There is a particular kind of silence that follows a door closing on a woman who has been judged without a trial. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Renfield, did not slam the door the morning he left Renfield Hall for London. He closed it with the composed, deliberate quiet of a man who believed he was acting with dignity. He had told himself, and would continue to tell himself for many months, that he had done everything required of him. He had married her. He had given her his name, his house, his title, and a generous monthly allowance that most women of her station would have found excessive. He had done his duty. What he had not done was look at her face when he left. He had not seen the way she stood at the top of the staircase, still in her traveling dress from the night before, watching the carriage pull away through glass that had not been cleaned in months. He had not seen that she did not weep. He had not noticed that she pressed her fingers flat against the cold windowpane, not to hold herself up, but to feel something solid in a world that had just become entirely uncertain. Her name was Cecily Marchmont, now Cecily Ashford, Duchess of Renfield, though no one in the hall seemed particularly eager to use the title. She had married him, so everyone whispered, for the money. What no one understood, what the Duke himself would not understand until far too late, was that she had already given away her last coin before they ever exchanged vows. This is the story of what she did with nothing, and what it cost him to finally see her. The marriage had been arranged in the way that most marriages among the English nobility were arranged in the year 1843, quickly, quietly, and with very little consideration for the feelings of the woman involved. Cecily was the youngest daughter of Baron Marchmont, a man whose charm had outlasted his fortune by roughly a decade. By the time the Baron died in February of that year, the family estate in Shropshire had been mortgaged twice over, the servants had gone largely unpaid since autumn, and the only thing of genuine value remaining in the house was a portrait of Cecily's mother that she would carry with her until the end of her days. The introduction to Edmund Ashford had been managed through a mutual acquaintance, Lord Petherwick, who collected useful connections the way other men collected stamps. Edmund required a wife. He had resisted the requirement for several years, but his solicitor, his estate steward, and his aunt Lady Constance had finally presented a unified argument he could not dismiss. The Renfield entail demanded a legitimate heir, the estate was hemorrhaging income from poor oversight, and his continued absence from his own properties was becoming a matter of public comment. A wife would provide stability. A wife would manage the household. A wife would silence the gossip. Cecily had been recommended as sensible, quiet, and grateful. The gratitude, Edmund had privately assumed, was tied to her financial circumstances. He was not entirely wrong, though he was entirely wrong about what she was grateful for. They had met precisely 3 times before the wedding. At a dinner, at a garden party, and once briefly in the hall of Petherwick House when he had mistaken her for a guest's companion and she had corrected him without flinching. That moment had caught his attention more than he wished to admit. She was not beautiful in the fashionable sense, she was slight, with dark eyes that observed more than they revealed, and a quality of stillness that unsettled people who were accustomed to being flattered. She did not flatter him. She spoke to him as though he were a person of ordinary importance, and he had found this both irritating and oddly refreshing. The wedding had taken place in March, on a day of bleak rain, in the parish church nearest to Renfield Hall in Northumberland. The estate staff had assembled in a perfunctory line of welcome. Cecily had stepped out of the carriage and looked up at the hall, grey stone, 4 stories, chimneys that were mostly cold, and said nothing. Not from despair. She was cataloguing. The wedding night had been formal, appropriate, and brief. Edmund had been courteous in the way that a man is courteous when he is already planning his departure. He had told her, with the measured tone he used for all significant communications, that he would be returning to London within the week. That his business affairs required his full attention. That she would find everything she needed at the hall. Everything, she had asked. He had paused very slightly. The household accounts will be made available to you. Mrs. Granger, the housekeeper, will assist you in understanding the arrangements. He had not answered her question. He had not meant to. He left on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the wedding, without saying goodbye properly, without asking if she was well, and without knowing that the allowance he had arranged so carefully was already 3 weeks delayed because of an administrative confusion in his London solicitor's office. Cecily had been informed of the delay by Mrs. Granger, who had delivered the news with the cautious expression of a woman checking to see how bad the reaction would be. Cecily had nodded, thanked her, and returned to the ledger she had already begun studying. The hall was not simply neglected. It was wounded. Cecily understood this within a fortnight of Edmund's departure. The roof above the east wing leaked in 2 rooms and had been leaking, by the evidence of the staining, for at least 3 years. The kitchen garden had been left unplanted the previous spring. 2 of the tenant farms on the outer edges of the Renfield land had fallen behind in their rents, not because the tenants were dishonest, but because the access road to the northern mill had collapsed after a flooding and had not been repaired, leaving the farmers unable to bring their grain to market. The household staff numbered 14, though the payroll suggested it should number 22. The difference lived in a kind of bureaucratic silence that told Cecily everything she needed to know about how the estate had been managed in recent years. She was 24 years old. She had Northwest formal training in estate management. What she had was a memory of watching her father's accountant work through the Marchmont books in the years before the worst of it, a natural aptitude for patterns and numbers, and the absolute absence of any other option. Her own personal funds were precisely what she had brought into the marriage, a small inheritance from her maternal grandmother, carefully preserved through the worst of her family's decline, amounting to £43. It was hers alone, independent of the Renfield allowance that had not yet arrived, and it sat in a locked tin box that she kept beneath the clothes press in her bedroom. In the 3rd week of April, Mrs. Granger came to her with a quiet urgency that the older woman tried to contain behind professional composure. The blacksmith in the village of Ashfield, the nearest village to the estate, had a daughter who had been ill since the winter. The illness had progressed. The child needed a physician from Hexham, but the blacksmith could not afford the fee, and without the blacksmith's work, the estate's horses could not be properly shod before planting season. Which meant the tenant farmers could not begin their work, which meant, Cecily held up a hand. "What is the physician's fee?" Mrs. Granger told her. Cecily opened her tin box. She counted out exactly what was needed, placed the coins in a small linen pouch, and gave it to Mrs. Granger without ceremony. "Have someone ride to Hexham today," she said. "Tell Dr. Pemberton it is at the request of the Duchess of Renfield." Mrs. Granger stared at the pouch for a moment. "Your Grace, this is, I understand the allowance has not yet arrived, and if this is from your personal, it is," Cecily said simply. "Send for the physician." She returned to her ledger. She did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as the only logical decision, because the blacksmith's daughter was a child and children should not die of curable illness because of a gap in administrative timing. She also, quietly and practically, understood that an estate whose surrounding village trusted its duchess was an estate with a foundation. The allowance arrived the following week. Cecily received it, noted the amount, divided it methodically into household needs, deferred repairs, and emergency reserves, and allocated nothing to herself. She did not tell anyone this. She wore the same 3 gowns she had brought from Shropshire, let out the hems with her own needle and thread when the colder evenings demanded it, and continued working. By May, she had met every tenant farmer on the Renfield lands. She had ridden out with old Thomas, the head groom, on a grey mare named Duchess who was, Thomas confided, the only horse in the stable with any real sense. The tenants had received her with varying degrees of wariness. By the 2nd visit, the wariness had softened. She listened. She took notes in a small leather book. She asked sensible questions and did not pretend to know things she did not know. One farmer, a square-faced man named Hartley, had looked at her for a long moment after she promised to raise the matter of the mill road with the estate steward. "You're nothing like I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. He squinted at the horizon. "Someone who'd stay indoors." The hall itself was her largest project, and she approached it the way she approached everything, methodically, patiently, and without fanfare. She began with the kitchen, because the kitchen was where warmth lived. She worked alongside the cook, Mrs. Hartwell, reorganizing the larder, identifying what could be preserved for winter, establishing a proper rotation of stores. She hired 2 additional kitchen girls from the village, a choice that the previous steward had apparently refused on grounds of unnecessary expenditure. Cecily read the steward's notes in the estate ledgers and formed a swift, clear judgment of his priorities that she kept entirely to herself. The east wing repairs were next. She negotiated with a local builder named Croft, who arrived expecting to be ignored or overcharged by a Duke's accountant. He arrived to find the Duchess herself, standing in the damaged room with a candle and a list of the specific damage she had catalogued, asking him precise questions about timber and tile and weatherproofing. He left the meeting having agreed to a price that was fair to both sides, which he mentioned to his wife that evening with an expression of genuine surprise. The locked room on the second floor presented a different kind of challenge. She had noticed it in her second week. A door at the end of the south corridor, locked, with a keyhole that showed signs of regular use but had clearly not been opened since before Edmund left. Mrs. Granger had gone carefully quiet when Cecily asked about it. "His Grace's late mother's room," she said at last. "He has the key." Cecily did not press further. But she noted the way the housekeeper's hands had folded tightly in front of her. And she filed the information beside everything else she was learning about Edmund Ashford, this man she had married and barely knew. She learned him in pieces. From the servants, who spoke of him in the guarded tones of people who respected and slightly feared their employer. From the letters that arrived addressed to him and which she carefully forwarded to his London address without opening. From a small oil painting in the library of a boy of perhaps 12, sitting stiffly in a formal suit. With Edmund's eyes and none of Edmund's composure, there was something frightened in the boy's posture that the painter had captured, perhaps accidentally. She learned that he had served briefly in the military in his early 20s. That his father had died when Edmund was 19, leaving him to manage the dukedom at an age when most young men were still making fashionable disasters of themselves in London. That his mother had died 4 years later, and that the locked room had been locked since that winter. She placed a small vase of dried lavender outside the locked door and did not explain to anyone why. The mill road was repaired in June, through a combination of Cecily's advocacy with the estate steward, a grey, defensive man named Pharaoh who had initially resisted her involvement and had gradually, through a process he could not entirely identify, come to consult her about everything, and a contribution from the estate accounts that Cecily had identified as a legitimate capital expenditure rather than discretionary spending. The farmers brought their grain to market. The rents came in. The numbers in the ledger shifted from red to black in 3 columns simultaneously. She stood in the garden on an evening in late June, looking at the kitchen garden she had overseen being planted in April, now showing the first serious growth. And she felt something that she did not have a word for. It was not pride, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a door opening outward rather than remaining closed. A letter arrived from London in the first week of July. It was the first letter Edmund had sent directly to her since his departure. It was a single paragraph, formally composed, asking her to confirm that she had received the monthly allowance and that the household was running satisfactorily. He signed it, "Your obedient servant, Renfield." She read it twice. Then she sat down and wrote him 4 pages. Edmund Ashford arrived at Renfield Hall on the 14th of September without advance warning. He had intended to send word ahead. He had written the message to Pharaoh, the estate steward, in his mind on the journey north. He had imagined arriving to find things much as he had left them, perhaps slightly more organized, given the reports from Pharaoh, who had begun corresponding with a frequency and detail that Edmund attributed to the men finally taking his responsibilities seriously. He had not attributed it to Cecily, because he had not thought of Cecily as the kind of person who inspired others to take their responsibilities seriously. He had thought of her, in the months since the wedding, as a quiet and grateful young woman who was comfortably installed in a large house that was infinitely better than the reduced circumstances from which he had delivered her. He had thought of her with the mild, slightly guilty detachment of a man who suspects he may have been unkind but cannot quite locate the specific moment. He came through the gate at dusk, when the light was turning the stone of the hall a deep amber, and he stopped his horse at the edge of the drive. The hall looked different. He could not immediately identify what had changed. The structure was the same. The grounds were the same. But something about it was inhabited, in a way it had not been before. The windows on the east wing showed light, which they had not shown in 3 years. The front steps had been cleared of the creeping moss that had been advancing on them for longer than Edmund cared to admit. There were flowers against the south wall that had not been planted by his mother, who had been dead for 9 years. The front door opened before he could knock, because Mrs. Granger had apparently been informed of his arrival by the groom who had seen him on the road. The housekeeper greeted him with the precise warmth of a woman who had, in recent months, developed strong loyalties to a different member of the household. "Your Grace," she said. "We weren't expecting, evidently," Edmund said, and stepped inside. The hall smelled of beeswax and dried herbs and something warm from the kitchen. A fire was burning in the main hearth, which had been cold on every one of the 9 Septembers Edmund had spent here since inheriting. The portraits in the entrance corridor had been cleaned. The chandelier had been lowered, polished, and rehung. He heard her before he saw her. A clear, unhurried voice, coming from the direction of the library, saying something to someone about a figure in the accounts. He walked toward the voice and found the library door open. Cecily was seated at the large library table with Pharaoh, the estate steward, and a man Edmund did not recognize who appeared to be a local builder. There were maps and ledgers spread across the table. She was holding a pencil and pointing to something on one of the maps, and Pharaoh was nodding in the concentrated way of a man who is receiving good instruction. None of them had noticed him yet. He stood in the doorway and looked at his wife. She was wearing a gown that was not new and had been altered, he noticed, at the hem. Her hair was pinned simply. She looked thinner than he remembered, and he felt a quick, uncomfortable thought about why that might be. She was speaking with an authority that was quiet and complete, the kind that does not need to announce itself. "The drainage on the east field can wait until spring," she was saying, "but the bridge at the north boundary must be done before first frost or we lose access to the Hartley farm for the winter. And we cannot have that again." "Your Grace," said Mrs. Granger from behind Edmund. Cecily looked up. Something crossed her face very quickly, something that was not quite surprise, not quite relief, and not at all what Edmund had expected. What he had perhaps expected, and was ashamed to recognize this expectation now, was vulnerability. A sudden deference. A reaching toward him. What he saw was a woman who looked at him, adjusted her assessment of the situation, and said, quite calmly, "Your Grace. We didn't receive word of your arrival." "I sent none," he said. A brief silence. Then she set down her pencil. "Gentlemen," she said to Pharaoh and the builder, "we'll continue this tomorrow morning." They gathered their papers and left with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to read a room. Edmund stepped into the library. Cecily remained seated, watching him take in the space, the reorganized shelves, the new fire screen before the hearth, the stack of estate ledgers that bore the marks of intensive recent use. "The East Wing repairs," he said. "Completed in August," she said. "You'll find the accounts in order." The cost was below Croft's initial estimate by £11. He picked up one of the ledgers. He opened it to the middle and read for a moment. He closed it. "Pharaoh writes to me," he said. "I know," she said. "I encouraged him to." "About you," he said. "I assumed as much." He set the ledger down. He was struggling, he realized, with the sensation of being in a room in which he did not know the rules, in a house that he owned but which no longer felt arranged for his convenience. "You've been very busy," he said, and heard immediately how thin the words were. "Yes," she said. And then, with a directness that was not sharp but was absolutely clear, there was a great deal to do. He stayed. It had been his intention to remain only a few days, to inspect the estate, review the accounts, satisfy himself that his absence had not caused any serious damage, and return to London. That plan survived approximately 48 hours. On the second morning, he rode out to the Hartley farm with Thomas, the head groom, and found that the mill road had been repaired and the access improved in ways that the estate steward's reports had mentioned but which he had not fully understood until he saw the result. On the third morning, he sat in the library with the ledgers and traced the estate's financial recovery over 7 months with the focused attention of a man reading a document that contradicts everything he thought he knew. He noticed, on the third day, that there was no personal expenditure recorded against Cecily's name in the household accounts for the months of March, April, or May. The allowance had been received and disbursed, but the disbursements were all to household functions, repairs, wages, and supplies. Nothing personal. He checked again. He said nothing about this. He filed the information with the painting of the frightened boy and the vase of dried lavender outside his mother's locked door, which he had noticed on the day he arrived and which had stopped him in the corridor for a full silent minute. The household treated Cecily with a warmth that bordered on protectiveness. He observed this at dinner, where Mrs. Hartwell had clearly taken particular care with the meal, and in the way Mrs. Granger deferred to Cecily on every household matter while treating Edmund with impeccable but slightly more formal courtesy. The servants had chosen a side, and they had chosen it months ago. He found this more affecting than he expected. Cecily herself was polite. She was not cold, she was too intelligent for theatrical coldness, but she maintained a distance that had the quality of architecture. Deliberate, load-bearing, not going anywhere. She answered his questions about the estate with precision. She asked him practical questions about his London affairs when they were relevant to estate business. She did not ask where he had been for 7 months, or whether he had thought of her, or why he had left so quickly. She did not need to ask. The questions were present in every room, simply by virtue of the fact that she had answered them herself, without him. On the 5th evening, they were seated in the drawing-room after dinner, she with a book, he with a report he had been failing to read for an hour, when he finally said, "Mrs. Baxter's daughter. The blacksmith's child." Cecily looked up from her book. "Pharaoh mentioned it," he said. "He mentioned that the physician's fee was paid before the household allowance had arrived. From personal funds." A silence. "The child was ill," Cecily said. "It was a significant sum." She recovered, she said simply, and returned to her book. He stared at the fire for a long time. The question he wanted to ask, why would you spend your last money on a blacksmith's child you had never met? Felt, when he assembled it in his mind, like an indictment of the person asking rather than an illumination of the person answering. He did not ask it. But he thought about it, in the quiet of his room that night, for a very long time. October arrived, and with it a crisis that forced them into the same room with the same problem for 8 consecutive days. A letter came from Lord Danvers, whose land bordered the northeast edge of the Renfield estate. Danvers was claiming rights to the stretch of common grazing that 3 of the Renfield tenant farmers had used for 30 years. Citing an 1811 agreement that he claimed superseded the existing arrangement. The letter was addressed to Edmund. Its language was legal, civil, and completely serious. Edmund brought the letter to the library, where Cecily was working, and placed it on the table without comment. She read it. She read it a second time. "The 1811 agreement," she said. "Do we have it?" "I don't know," he said. Which was, he recognized as he said it, a significant admission. "The estate records before 1830 are in the north storeroom," she said. "I haven't gone through all of them. I was going to begin that work in November." They began it that afternoon. The storeroom was cold and smelled of old paper and mice. They worked by candlelight in the days when the sky closed in, and by the pale autumn light of the one high window when it permitted. Edmund found himself doing something he had not done in years, sitting on the floor amid stacks of documents, coat removed, sleeves rolled, working through papers with systematic attention. Cecily worked beside him, and she was faster than he was, her eyes moving across documents with a trained efficiency that he found, against every expectation, impressive and oddly comfortable. On the 3rd day, she found it. "Edmund," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his given name for the first time, and they both heard it in the sudden quiet. He looked up. She held out the document without explaining, and he took it and read it. The 1811 agreement existed. But it was not what Danvers had described. It was an agreement between Danvers's father and Edmund's grandfather establishing a mutual access arrangement, which, critically, had included a clause of mutual continuation tied to the continued presence of Renfield tenants on the land in question. The Renfield tenants had been there continuously. Danvers's claim was false, or more charitably, based on a document he had perhaps never read carefully. He was either misled by his solicitor or he was counting on our not finding this, Edmund said. Or both, Cecily said. They looked at each other across the pile of papers on the storeroom floor. It was the first moment of pure equality they had shared, 2 people who had solved a problem together, with equal contribution, and both of them knew it. "Thank you," he said. "And then, because that was insufficient, I wouldn't have found it." "You would have," she said. "I simply had more time already invested in understanding the records." She said this without vanity or false modesty, as a plain statement of fact. And something in Edmund shifted, a thing that had been braced against a wall for years, slowly releasing. That evening, he told her about his mother. He did not plan to. They were in the library again, the Danvers document safely copied and sent to the Renfield solicitor, and the fire was doing its steady October work against the cold. And he had been sitting in silence for long enough that the silence itself had changed quality. "The lavender," he said. Outside her room. Cecily did not look startled. "I hoped it wasn't unwelcome." "She loved lavender," he said. A pause. "She died in that room. In the winter. I was in London." Another pause, longer. "I did not come home in time." The fire spoke into the quiet. "I have kept the room locked," he said, "because I could not decide whether it was preservation or punishment." Cecily set down the book she had not been reading. "Perhaps it was simply grief," she said. "In the shape that grief takes when it has no safe direction." He looked at her. "You don't have to open it," she said. "But if you did, I think it would be a room, and not a wound." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the Northumberland hills with the sound of something that had been held back and was now being let go. "I was 19 when my father died," he said finally. "I have been managing consequences since I was 19. I don't," he stopped. "I am not certain I know how to do otherwise." "I know," she said. There was nothing patronizing in the words. They were simply accurate, and the accuracy of them, coming from her, was more piercing than any reproach. The storm came in the third week of October, arriving from the north with 3 days' warning in the form of a bruised sky and a drop in temperature that the old farmers read with quiet alarm. It was Thomas, the head groom, who found the problem. The bridge at the north boundary, the same bridge Cecily had identified in September as requiring urgent repair, which had been delayed by the Danvers crisis, was already weakened, and the storm would likely take it. If the bridge went, the Hartley farm and 2 others would be cut off from the hall and from the village for the duration of winter. It was not a theoretical inconvenience. It was a family with 3 children and an elderly grandparent who would have no access to medical care or supplies in the worst weather of the year. Edmund was already pulling on his coat before Thomas had finished the sentence. Cecily was 3 steps behind him. He turned and looked at her. She was wearing her riding coat and had her gloves in one hand and her small leather notebook in the other. "You should stay inside," he said. "The Hartleys are my tenants," she said calmly. "I know their situation and their needs, and I have already spoken to Croft about the bridge materials." "You don't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not resistance anymore. It was recognition. They rode north through the beginning of the storm together. The next 2 days were the kind that strip everything ceremonial from human beings. The bridge repair required every available hand from the estate and several from the village. The storm came harder than predicted, and the work continued in driving rain and wind that made communication difficult and exhaustion swift. Edmund worked alongside Croft and the estate workers with the physical commitment of a man who had once been a soldier and had never entirely lost the knowledge of what his body could do when necessity required it. Cecily managed the supply chain, keeping the workers fed with food brought from the hall kitchen by an increasingly heroic Mrs. Hartwell, communicating between groups, making the 100 small decisions that kept the effort coherent when the weather threatened to make everything chaotic. On the first night, sheltering in the Hartley farmhouse while the storm peaked, she fell asleep in a chair by the kitchen fire, still in her riding coat, her notebook open on her knee. Edmund sat across from her and watched her sleep for a long moment. He thought about what she had told him, carefully and matter-of-factly, 2 weeks ago, that she had arrived at Renfield Hall with £43 and a portrait of her mother. And that she had spent the first several months working from those £43 and the delayed allowance, and that she had not spent a single coin of either on herself. He had done the arithmetic. He knew what she had gone without. He knew why she looked thinner. He also knew, with the cold clarity of a man who has finally stopped defending a position he had no right to take, that everything he had assumed about her motivations had been wrong. She had not married him for money. She could have spent every pound of his estate's income on gowns and travel and every comfort that should have been hers by virtue of her title. She had instead spent her last personal coin on a blacksmith's child she had never met. And then she had quietly rebuilt everything around her while he had been in London, maintaining a comfortable distance from any emotion that might require something of him. The bridge held. When they rode back to the hall on the second morning, in the thin clear light that follows a storm, and the Hartley family was safe and the north boundary was secured and the tenants who lined the road to cheer them, specifically her, Edmund looked at his wife with the expression of a man who has understood something that cannot be ununderstood. She did not see him looking. She was waving back at a small girl who was throwing wet leaves from a fence post. He found her in the garden the following afternoon. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen garden, looking at what the storm had done to the late-season planting. Some of it was salvageable. Some of it was not. She was making notes in her leather book with the pragmatic calm of someone who does not waste energy on what cannot be recovered. He stood beside her and looked at the garden for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited, her pencil still. "I believed," he said, and then started again, because the word believed was not right, it was too passive. "I assumed, when we married, I assumed that your circumstances drove your decision. That you had married the title and the income and the name, and that in accepting that arrangement, we understood each other clearly." He paused. "I was wrong." Cecily said nothing. She was watching him with those dark, observant eyes that took everything in and gave nothing away prematurely. "I left you here," he said. "Without introduction. Without support. Without the resources I had promised, which were delayed, and I didn't even know they were delayed, because I had not troubled to confirm them. I left you in a house that was falling into ruin, with no staff that was properly paid, no support from the village, and no indication that I intended to return." He stopped. The garden was very quiet. "And I told myself that I had done my duty. That you had what you needed. That the arrangement was mutual and fair." "It was not fair," she said. Quietly. Without drama. "No," he said. "It was not." He reached into his coat and produced a small object, the key to the locked room. He had asked Mrs. Granger for it that morning. He set it on the stone garden wall between them. "I would like to open the room," he said. "If you would come with me." She looked at the key for a moment. Then she put her pencil and notebook in her pocket. "Yes," she said. They walked through the hall in the particular silence of two people who are carrying something significant between them. Up the south corridor staircase, along the second floor, to the door at the end. Edmund put the key in the lock. The mechanism was stiff from disuse and gave only after considerable effort, as though the room itself had opinions about being entered. Inside, it was cold and still and full of pale afternoon light through uncovered windows. His mother's furniture was exactly as it had been. Her writing desk, her chair by the window, the small landscape she had painted herself and hung above the mantel, amateur work, but recognizably skilled, full of color and movement. Edmund stood in the doorway for a moment that was clearly difficult for him in ways he would not narrate aloud. Then he stepped inside. Cecily followed. She looked at the painting above the mantel. "She was talented," she said. "She was," he said. She was nothing like I am. She was warm. She was easy with people. Everyone who met her liked her immediately." He looked at the painting. "I used to worry, when I was young, that I was not enough like her. That I had taken too much from my father, who was capable but not warm." Cecily looked at him. "You sat in a storeroom on the floor and read estate documents for 8 days, she said. And then you stood in a storm for 2 days to repair a bridge for 3 farming families. That is not a cold man. That is a man who doesn't know how to begin." He turned to look at her. "She would have liked you," he said. Then, more quietly, "I should have tried to." The afternoon light came through the window and fell across the floor between them. Outside, the kitchen garden was waiting to be assessed and replanted. The Hartley farm was secure. The mill road was open. The hall was warm. "Edmund," she said, and this time, neither of them noted the first name, because it was already simply true, "I did not marry you for the money. I want you to know that, not because it matters what you think of my character, but because it matters that we begin from what is true." "I know that," he said. "I have known it for some time. I was not willing to know it before." "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The question was fair and he owed it a real answer. "Because if you married me for something other than the practical arrangement I had constructed," he said, "then I had an obligation I had not met. And I have been more comfortable with obligations I could manage from a distance." "And now," she said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent a great deal of his life managing his face and has just decided to stop. "I would like to be here," he said. "Not from obligation. Because this," he gestured, and the gesture took in the room, the hall, the garden outside, the window, the painting, all of it. "This is not the house I left. You made it into something I did not know it could be. You made it a home. You did that with £43 and no help and no guarantee that anyone would ever notice. And you gave away your last coin to a child who needed it and then went back to work." His voice was steady, but only just. "I would like to be worthy of what you have built here. I am not certain I am yet. But I would like to try." Cecily looked at him for a long, honest moment. "Then begin," she said. "Not as a challenge. As an invitation." He reached out and took her hand, there in his mother's sunlit room, with the autumn afternoon coming through the glass and the sound of the estate below them going about its ordinary, living work. Her hand was warm and firm and she did not pull it away. She turned it slightly so that their fingers met properly, and she held on. They opened the window, the first time it had been opened in 9 years, and let the cold, clean Northumberland air come in. Later, they walked back through the hall together. Not side by side in the careful, formal way of two people maintaining appropriate distance, but close enough that their arms brushed, comfortable with the proximity. Mrs. Granger saw them in the entrance hall and produced a smile she immediately tried to discipline back into professional neutrality and did not entirely succeed. Edmund wrote to Lord Danvers the following morning, from the library, with Cecily across the table working on the kitchen garden replanting plan. The letter was clear, legal, and final. The grazing rights were unambiguous. He also wrote to his solicitor in London, a longer letter, containing instructions about the management of the monthly allowance, the estate capital account, and several other matters that would take the solicitor some time to process but which reflected, in their detail and their direction, the understanding of a man who intended to be present going forward. He signed this letter as he had never signed anything in his life, "Yours, Edmund." Not the Duke. Not Renfield. Edmund. He showed Cecily the letter before he sealed it. She read it carefully, and when she was done she looked up and he saw, for the first time since March, that the distance she had been maintaining, the intelligent, dignified, necessary distance of a woman who had learned not to rely on a man who had not earned her reliance, had eased. It had not disappeared. It would take longer than one honest afternoon in a sunlit room to fully close the gap that 9 months had made. But it had eased. "It's a good letter," she said. "I mean all of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it's good." In November, they went through the estate records together, systematically, in the order they should have been reviewed from the beginning. In December, Edmund rode out with Cecily to the farms, and the tenants received him differently than they had received him before, with respect still, but with the particular warmth that came from knowing he had stood in the storm alongside them. With the warmth that came from knowing his wife. On a morning in January, when the frost lay thick on the garden and the kitchen warmth spread through the hall from a stove that was never cold anymore, Edmund found the small tin box in the back of the kitchen dresser where Cecily had stored it after the move. It was empty. It had been empty since April. He placed it on her desk in the library without comment. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "The blacksmith's daughter," she said. "She is very well. I visit her on Thursdays." "I know," he said. "Thomas told me. She calls you the lady with the lavender." Cecily smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded, and it was the first time he had seen it without any shadow behind it. He reached into his coat and placed a small velvet purse beside the tin box. She looked at him, questioning. "It is not the allowance," he said. "It is yours. From me. Because you should have had it from the beginning, and because whatever you do with it, I trust your judgment entirely." She opened the purse. She looked at the coins inside. She looked at him. "I'm not going to give it all away immediately," she said. "I know," he said. "Though I confess I wouldn't be surprised if you did." She put the purse in her drawer and locked it with the small key that had always hung on the chain at her wrist. Then she looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes that observed everything and forgave carefully and loved. He was beginning to understand. With the same methodical and complete commitment with which she did everything. Edmund, she said. Stay. Yes, he said. He meant it as completely as he had ever meant anything in his life. He sat down across from her at the library table, pulled the nearest ledger toward him, and went to work. Outside, the January frost was doing its quiet, temporary work on the garden that would grow again in spring. The hall was warm. The tenants were secure. The north bridge stood. The locked room breathed open air. And the woman who had married a duke who thought he knew her, who had arrived with 43 pounds and a portrait of her mother and the absolute refusal to be reduced, had become not what he had expected, but what he had needed all along, which was everything. If this story moved you, if Cecily's quiet strength, or the moment Edmund finally saw her, settled something in your heart, then you are exactly who this story was made for. Leave a comment below and tell us, what was the moment you knew he understood? Your words mean more than you know to this community. If you loved this story, please share it with someone who deserves a beautiful listen today, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a new tale of love that is slowly, honestly, and completely earned. We will see you in the next chapter.